I'm not Mike, so I'm going to try to project as best I can. If you can't hear me or if I'm getting too quiet, wave your hand at me. I'll try to kick it up a notch, but I think the acoustics in this room are pretty good. We should be good. I'm also kind of a pacer, so if I get out here in the way of the slides, again, wave your hand at me. I'll try to get out of the way. My name's Joel Graff. I've lived in Dixon for about 20 years, early 2000. I married my wife Nicole in 2005, and we have two children, Micah and Silas. They're sitting there in the back of the room. I'm sure she's thrilled I just pointed her out. And I have worked here in Dixon for the Department of Transportation as an engineer. And I became a licensed professional engineer in the state of Illinois in 2006. What I'm talking about today has nothing to do with my professional work. It's just my day job. But in terms of technology, I'm sort of a technology geek. I like to do a lot of software development, 3D modeling, visualization, that sort of thing. I've done some drone simulation, machine learning to do predictive cost analysis, and a lot of other odds and ends, stuff that interests me. But what I'm talking about today is thinking open. In other words, what we're talking about open source software and the role that it has in our day-to-day lives, both personal and business. When I talk about open source software, what exactly is that? What exactly am I talking about? Well, open source is simply a development methodology. It's a way of making software. When we go about writing software, when a software programmer starts writing software, they use a computer programming language like C++ or C# or Visual Basic or JavaScript or some other language. There's hundreds of them out there. And they write them in a plain text file. Now, if you're not a software developer, you can look at all that code and say, I have no idea what that means. But you can at least recognize that those are words. Those are meaningful expressions that if someone took the time to explain to you, you could probably make some sense of. But human readable source code, what we write our software in, isn't very useful to a computer. If a computer needs to understand, or in order for a computer to run a program, it needs to be converted to machine readable code or binary code. And if you take a file and you convert it from the human readable source code to machine readable binary code and then try to open that in like a text editor or a word processor, all you see is complete gibberish. Nobody can edit that, okay? When we're talking about open source, what we're getting at is basically defined by this process. We take our source code, written in plain text, and we do a process called compilation. We compile it to produce a binary file to produce machine readable code. If you use Windows and you've ever seen a .exe file, you probably know if you double click on that file, it'll launch a program, it'll run a program, because that's been compiled to a binary machine readable code the computer understands. When we talk about open source software, that's the difference we're talking about. When you use open source software, you are using software that runs on your computer that gives you access to the original source code. So if that program doesn't run the way you want it to, and you happen to know a little bit about coding, you can actually go in, change the source code, recompile it, and fix that bug or add that extra feature or make it do what you want it to do. Most of us don't want to do that. But it's the critical element that makes open source what it is. Because when you buy a copy of Microsoft Windows or you download an app for your iPhone, you're not getting the source code to that. You're only getting that machine readable binary code, okay? So the difference then between open source and proprietary is that the source code for open source software is available, whereas with proprietary closed source, it's not. And in fact, it would be illegal for you to have access to that proprietary source code. Why? Because software vendors who manufacture proprietary closed source software view that source code as intellectual property. It's patented. And under US patent law, it would be illegal for you to have possession of it. So how did open source actually get its legs? What actually gave it momentum? Well, back in the late 70s, early 80s, these machines started to show up. Maybe some of you actually remember using them. The first computer I had was actually made a couple years after that. It's called the Commodore VIC-20. But this is an IBM PC. It was made in 1981. Prior to this, if you wanted a computer, it was going to cost you several $100,000 and it would fill an entire room. And if you wanted software to run on that computer, you were going to have to buy a license for the Unix operating system from AT&T and Bell Labs. And that would cost you $160,000 per user. Obviously, they were catering to corporate entities and large government units, people that could afford those huge systems. When hardware commoditized and was commercially successful for the mass market, there was a void that needed to be filled because the software didn't scale with it. So people needed to start producing commodity level software. And that's where this guy shows up. Some of you might recognize him. That's Bill Gates, smiling for his mugshot after he was arrested for a traffic violation in Albuquerque, New Mexico in 1975. Lucky for Bill, he turned from his life of crime and that same year founded a little company called Microsoft. Some of you may have heard of it. A few years after that, Bill buys a new operating system, one that's a lot cheaper than Unix. And it's called DOS, short for Disk Operating System. And he goes around with DOS, only he called it MS-DOS, and he goes around to the OEMs, the original equipment manufacturers, the guys making these computers. And he says, hey, I got this nifty, cool operating system. I'll license it to you dirt cheap on one condition, that my operating system is the only one you ship with your computers. A lot of them, they agreed to that exclusive arrangement. And as a result, MS-DOS and the IBM PC architecture became the most popular platform for software throughout the entire 1980s. All right, I'm not saying it was the best one, but it was certainly the most popular, largely because of what Bill Gates did with the OEMs. As a result, this created a whole new market for commercialized software that we'd never seen before. People started creating software for the IBM PC and MS-DOS platform like crazy and started making a killing. Bill was making millions with Microsoft. About that time, though, this guy shows up. That's Richard Stallman. Now, Richard Stallman remembered what computing was like back in the 1960s. He remembered back in the 1960s, man, software was free. You could do anything you wanted. You could take the source code, you could modify it, you could copy the software, you could give it away, you could do whatever you wanted and no one cared. And he says, this proprietary software, man, this stinks. It's no good. In fact, he said it's morally wrong. And so he founded the Free Software Foundation. Now understand, when Stallman talked about free software, he wasn't talking about free as in what you paid for it. He's talking about free as in what you can do with it. Free as in freedom. In this arena, it's often talked about in terms of free as in beer versus free as in speech. He was more concerned about free as in speech than free as in beer. So along with founding the Free Software Foundation to advocate the development and use of free software, he also created the GNU Public License, or the GPL. This is the first license for free software. And it's called a copyleft license because the GPL was designed to be the exact opposite of the licenses that you see on commercial or proprietary software. Because your standard copyright proprietary license says it protects the rights of the software author. Users are not allowed to modify. Users are not allowed to distribute. Users are not allowed to copy. The GPL is copyleft. It protects the rights of the user. Users are free and in fact encouraged to modify, encouraged to distribute, and encouraged to copy. Okay, so they were at opposite ends of the spectrum. So Stallman spent the entire 1980s devoting his life's work to the Free Software Foundation and the GPL and was more or less ignored, frankly because everyone else was having too much fun selling commercial software. Then this guy shows up, and this is in August of 1991. This guy, his name is Linus Torvalds, he was a student at the University of Helsinki in Finland. And he logs onto the internet and he posts a message on the Usenet. The Usenet was sort of the internet before the World Wide Web. And he posts a message that says, hey guys, I just made this little operating system. It's not going to be any big thing, but I thought I'd throw it out there, see what you all thought. Because, you know, Finnish guys say y'all. And he put it out there and people started noodling around with it. And they're like, this is kind of cool. And it got popular. It got really popular. And next thing you know, Linus realized it was popular enough, he had put a license on it. So he put Stallman's GPL. At that point, it was a GPL version 2. He put the GPL license on what was known as Linux. That's Linux's mascot, Tux. Linux got incredibly popular in the next 10 years. And the reason was because the source code was freely available. Finally, people could take and modify an operating system to make it do whatever they really wanted it to do. And they developed Linux to serve any number of different purposes, something they could never have done with Apple or Microsoft. And in the following 10 years, Linux just exploded and it went crazy. And by the time 2001 rolled around, Bill Gates, you know, that guy, had this to say about Linux. He said, our most potent operating system competitor is Linux and the phenomena around open source and free software. The academic community, startup companies, foreign governments are putting their best work into Linux. He wrote that in an email and then retired shortly thereafter. And he was replaced by this guy. That's Steve Ballmer. He took over as Microsoft CEO, and that same year he said this: Linux is a cancer that attaches itself in an intellectual property sense to everything it touches. Now, what he was talking about was the GPL license and how it really doesn't play very well with copyright proprietary licensing. And there's some good reason for him saying that, but all the same, he called Linux a cancer. And that set the tone for the next 10 years of how Microsoft viewed open source and Linux. And really what happened is Microsoft waged open war on open source and Linux, on a community, or on a software development methodology that's almost entirely voluntary in the way it's managed. Then this guy took over. 2011, Ballmer retires, and this guy, Satya Nadella, takes over. He's Microsoft's current CEO. And as soon as he got in that position, he said this: Microsoft loves open source. And the open source community says, yeah, right. But a few years later, he said this: Microsoft loves Linux. And you could hear the jaws collectively drop throughout the entire open source community. Most of them didn't believe him. A lot of them still don't. But the fact of the matter is in the time Nadella has been in charge of Microsoft, Microsoft has changed direction almost entirely on its position on open source. The company has developed a number of popular open source projects, has even open sourced some of their core proprietary technologies like .NET. And currently, Microsoft, if I'm right, Microsoft is currently the largest contributor to the Linux kernel project. Why the change? Well, if you ask me, I think Nadella saw the writing on the wall. Open source is a force they could not beat, so they decided to join it. So where is the Linux kernel project today? Well, it's the world's largest software project. Over 4,000 developers actively contribute to it. A lot of them are individuals doing it in their spare time for free. But a lot of them are paid by over 500 companies to do active development on the Linux kernel. The top 500 supercomputers in the world run Linux, including IBM's Jeopardy-winning Watson. One of the Navy's latest destroyers, the Zumwalt, runs entirely on Linux. And a lot of their US military drones are running or migrating to the Linux operating system. And over half of the internet currently runs on Linux. So we see that in terms of market share, Linux is dominating the large-scale enterprise space. But what about the consumer space? You know, mobile and desktop. Well, on the mobile side, Linux is actually doing quite well. Linux is better known as Android. Google manufactures the Android operating system and is built on the Linux kernel. And it currently has 87% of the global market share on mobile operating systems. iOS, Apple's iPhone and the like, has the remaining 13%. The desktop, it's a little different story. Their Windows dominates, has 88% of the market share. The reason for that is they've been doing the desktop for 30 years. It's a little hard to break that hold that they've got. OS X takes another 10%, Linux 2%. Understand though that 2%, though it's a small part of the market share, that represents millions of users worldwide. And in fact, this presentation I'm giving you today is done on entirely free and open source software. I'm using an open source Office suite, and the laptop I'm using runs Linux. And I've been using Linux exclusively for 5 years now. But the real drive, the real reason for the success of open source against the proprietary software is really more of a moral or ethical reason than it is anything else. This is Karen Sandler. She's the executive director of the Software Freedom Conservancy. She's an engineer and a lawyer. And she calls herself the cyborg lawyer because she has a defibrillator literally implanted in her heart. And the reason for that is she has an enlarged heart. It's 3 times the size of the average human heart. And people with this condition are prone to sudden death, to cardiac arrest with little or no warning. And in order to mitigate that, she's had this procedure done, which puts this defibrillator in to obviously deal with that issue. Now, as she tells the story, when she was considering having the procedure done, she was talking with her cardiologist, and he gives her the hardware that they'd be putting in her to deal with this condition. And she takes it and she holds it in her hand, she looks at it and she says, "Oh, that's nice. What software does it run?" And the doctor just looked at her, he's like, what do you mean software? He never thought about it. She's like, hardware don't run without software. I want to see the source code. My life is hanging in the balance here. And he says, well, we don't know that. You have to go to the manufacturer. So she goes to the medical device manufacturer. The woman is a lawyer, and she has a moral imperative to see the source code that her life is going to depend upon. You think she can get it? No. That source code is closed source. It's proprietary, and they had no legal obligation whatsoever to share it with her, and they didn't. So, if you ask Karen Sandler what she thinks about open source, she'll say this: my life depends on the proprietary software that is literally connected to my heart. I can't review the code, and I know that there have been no proper procedures for its review by anyone else. It is impossible now for me to see software freedom as anything other than of core importance to our society as a whole. Now you might say that this is a niche case. You know, how many people have that situation going on? And that's true. But how many of you know somebody, or maybe even have yourself an insulin pump and depend upon that for your life and health? I guarantee you the software it runs is not open source. Moreover, autonomous vehicles, they've been in the news recently if you hadn't noticed. They're coming, and they're coming a lot sooner than people realize. What software do those cars run? How do we know that software is safe and it's not going to endanger our lives? Well, if it's closed source, we can't. So what is the business case then for open source? Why should a business consider adopting? Well, there's three key advantages that open source software provides over closed source. The first is security, the second, total cost of ownership, and the third, sustainability. When we talk about security, we're talking about things like spyware, backdoors, and viruses. Let's say I'm a person who wants to manufacture nefarious software that infects your system, takes your data ransom, or gives me backdoor access to your computer without you knowing it. The last thing I'm going to do is open source it, because I sure as heck don't want anybody seeing that source code, right? I am going to attach a little binary blob in an email, and I'm going to send it to you and say, click on this. You'll be glad you did, right? And just hope you follow the instructions and you just follow through. The thing is if you're using open source software is more or less immune to these sorts of abuses. I mean, anything's possible, I'll grant that. But by and large, it would be extremely difficult. I can't think of a situation where open source software could come with a virus as a part of the code. And the reason for that is because if I want to take advantage of an open source software, I have to get the software community I have to get that community to accept my binary blob. No, they're not going to do that. They're open source. They want to see the source code. And the moment they see that source code, then they're definitely not going to take it because they know it's bad. Open source communities are inherently sensitive to issues concerning data privacy and security. Some are extremely sensitive to that. You don't have that on the proprietary side. In fact, it's just the reverse. Why? Because proprietary vendors make their money on you and the way you use your software and your hardware. Quick question. Can anyone name for me the world's largest advertising agency? Google. 2016, Google made $20 billion in ad revenue, twice the runner-up. Now, how much of your digital life do you live on your smartphone? How much banking do you do? Web surfing, Facebook posts, email, right? If you have an Android device, you are living your digital life on a device provided to you by the world's largest advertising agency. Do you think you can reasonably expect digital privacy and security on that when they make their money off of knowing as much about you as possible? Now, I'm not saying Google is evil. Don't misunderstand me. They could be a lot worse than they are. But there's an inherent conflict of interest when you use proprietary software and expect security and privacy. With open source, that conflict is gone. Total cost of ownership. We see this in 4 key ways. Number 1, in terms of infrastructure, when you use open source software, you do not have to buy proprietary hardware. Open source software is designed to run on commercial off-the-shelf hardware. So you don't have to get your hardware from one vendor. You can buy it from all over the place. Second, you have open source software supports older hardware. Much better than proprietary software does. Licensing, user freedom. You can do anything you want with that software, and you don't pay upfront licensing fees. You future-proof your costs. Why? Because when you use open source software, it scales for free. The bigger your company gets, the more copies you can install, and you don't have to pay anybody anything for the extra seats. And vendor neutrality. When you use open source software, you're saving your data in open data formats. You don't have to worry about your data being locked into a proprietary data format and having to convert from, say, WordPerfect to Microsoft Word. Okay? If you don't like the open source word processor you're using, you can go to another and your data goes with you. No conversions required because the formats are open. And finally, support. When we talk about support, you can get free support in the community. And if you pick a good open source project with a good community, 90% of the time, all of your questions will be answered pretty quickly and easily. In fact, if I go to a good open source community and I post a question in the forums, I'd expect an answer within a day or two. I'd be surprised if it took as much as a week. Sometimes it does take longer. It is free after all. But paying for software, paying for support is certainly not the wrong thing to do. In fact, I want to point out that it's not wrong to pay for software. But if you're going to pay for anything, you want to pay for support. You want to lay out your cash for something that is going to give you a direct, tangible benefit, knowing that somebody is there 24/7 to answer your questions and deal with your issues. Then there's sustainability. And when we talk about sustainability, there's two rules. Rule number one, open source never dies. The source code is always available. Even if the maintainer says, look, I got a life, a wife and kids and other things, I can't keep doing this, and they walk away from it, chances are someone else in the community will step up and say, okay, we need to keep this going. All right? Open source never dies. And even if it becomes abandoned, the source code's still there. The second rule is a proprietary software must be profitable. If it ceases being profitable, then it ceases being supported. And the people who use it now have to pay for the upgrade in order to continue getting support for that software. So when we talk about alternatives, what alternatives are there to commercial software in the open source ecosystem? Well, the truth is that most any commonly used commercial software has a good open source alternative by now. But before we talk about alternatives, it's important to understand one key thing. And that is that when people look at open source software, comparing it to what they're used to, they fall prey to the feature parity fallacy. And the feature parity fallacy is what people encounter when they look at the open source and say, oh man, I just didn't like it. Well, what didn't you like? Oh, the UI, the user interface was just kind of weird, or I couldn't quite see how to figure out how to do this function, and I didn't want to go to the forums and have to post questions. And they give all these reasons of why the open source experience wasn't quite as good as proprietary, therefore it's not worth it. But the problem is when you buy a proprietary piece of software, a lot of times you're laying out your money for something like this, when all you really needed was that. You see, an open source software project, if it's matured and it's been around for a while, what they'll do is they tend to develop the features that the community wants the most. They're not going to spend their time developing these crazy, advanced features just so they can claim feature parity with their commercial competitor. They're going to spend their time focusing on the features that the community wants and those that are most valuable. So it's a great opportunity as a business to look at your software, or even as an individual, to look at your software and ask yourself the question, how much do I really need? How many of us use every single feature in Microsoft Office or Adobe Photoshop? If you're a power user, maybe the open source solution isn't going to be good enough for you, but for most people out there, the open source alternatives provide more than enough. So when we talk about alternatives, Office Suite's top of the list. Microsoft Office in the cloud version, Office 365, their open source options are LibreOffice and Collabra Online. Collabra provides a subscription-based service. If you want to put LibreOffice in the cloud yourself, you can do that for free. It requires some technical expertise, but Collabra will do it for you for a price, and it's probably worth paying for. We talk about graphics. There's the Adobe Software Suite, Illustrator, and Photoshop. Okay? Again, if your workflows are tied very closely to the Adobe software and very finely tuned to the way Adobe works, you're not going to like the open source alternatives. But if you like using Photoshop or Illustrator and their advanced features, but you're not necessarily a power user, chances are on the open source side you'll find what you need. On the business side, we have QuickBooks and Salesforce CRM as the proprietary options. The open source are GNU Cache, Suite CRM, and I don't know if it's Odoo or Odoo. I've never heard it pronounced. The last one there, Odoo, it provides comprehensive business software, ERP, CRM, accounting, websites, shopping cart software as a service, all sorts of great cloud services. They're a subscription service, obviously. Their software is open source. You can use it for free, but if you pay them, they do a lot of the dirty work for you. Operating systems. Why would you choose Linux over Windows or OS X? Well, there's actually a number of reasons, and these come from my personal experience. First and foremost, in my mind, is updates. They don't ever require your computer to restart. They don't take a long time to do. And sometimes Windows will try to force updates on you or force new software on you that you didn't want or didn't ask for. I remember when I was still using Windows 7, Microsoft tried to push Windows 10 to my computer as an update. I didn't want anything to do with that. Spying. Windows 10 got a lot of bad PR because they do a lot of data collection. And if you want to shut that off, you have to go in and specifically say bad Windows, and tell it do not collect this. Okay, you have to do what's called opting out. With open source, they never collect your data. And if they do, they will explicitly tell you and say, are you willing to opt in? Okay. Bit rot. If any of us have used Windows any amount of time, we know that it tends to get slower with age. OS X is susceptible to this too. I've never really seen it happen in the years that I've used Linux. Viruses. This is a controversial topic. If you Google it, you're going to see a variety of opinions. But the fact of the matter is when you run Linux, you are inherently less susceptible to viruses. In fact, I have never run a virus scanner on my laptop. I'm not saying that's a good practice. I'm just saying it's really hasn't been necessary for me. Kernel panic. In the Windows world, we call this the blue screen of death. Your computer goes, uh-oh, I don't know what to do. And you have to reboot it if you want to continue using it. It happens. I can reinstall a Linux operating system inside 20 minutes and not lose any data for having done it. It's a very simple, fast process. Hardware support, very good across all the operating systems. The advantage to Linux is I can use Linux on systems that are 10, 20, even 30 years old. And finally, compatibility. Linux will actually allow you to run some Windows software. I think I can run Microsoft Office directly under Linux using an application called Wine, which is the Windows emulator. It's actually not an emulator, but it's the Windows support layer for Linux. Another place where open source excels is phone systems. There's open source phone systems. And an interesting use case is Sauk Valley Community College. They've recently turned to an open source phone system, and they'll tell you that it's much easier to administer. It's very good quality. It's reduced their infrastructure, reduced the point of failure, and of course, they're saving all sorts of money. They're very happy with it. Finally, when you're talking about migrating from proprietary to open source software, it's important to keep in mind certain strategies. You don't want to just jump in with both feet. That can cost you a lot. First and foremost, the sooner the better. If you're early on in a business and you haven't bought a lot of software, the sooner you adopt open source and don't get bought into proprietary vendor lock-in, the better. But if you are, go for the low-hanging fruit. Look for applications you don't use very often or stuff that doesn't really have a big critical part of your daily workflow, and try working with open source in those areas. Another thing you can do is install the open source solutions alongside. You don't have to uninstall Microsoft Office to install LibreOffice, for example. You can install alongside and you can contrast and compare and convert your documents. Commit your data. Save your data in open data formats. You don't have to install LibreOffice to start using open data formats with Microsoft Office. Microsoft Office supports ODF formats, the open data format. I think it's ODT under Word, ODS for Excel. And if you start doing that, and if you convert all of your data to an open data format, it makes transitioning to an open source software much easier. And finally, have a long-term plan. Identify what open source technologies you want to integrate, how you want to integrate them, and the timeline in which you want to achieve that integration. If without that long-term plan, you might get started, but you'll never actually get finished. And those are kitty cats. Are there any questions? Yes.
Go ahead.
So what's the incentive? How does the capitalism work in terms of incentives for the open source community to develop product and make it available?
Well, it depends on who you're talking to. The primary incentive, if you ask me as a developer, I contribute to an open source project called FreeCAD. It's a 3D CAD modeling. The reason why people do this is because they think they can make a quality piece of software that's just as good as the commercial competition, and they could do it for free. They could do it without charge. A lot of people, and I didn't really buy into this when I started doing open source development, but a lot of people really do open source because they believe by doing it they're changing the world. There's a moral imperative. They feel like there's a moral or ethical reason for doing it. In other countries, I'll give you examples in engineering. In civil engineering, we don't share very well. If you want to do civil engineering with high quality software, you're going to spend $12,000, $20,000, $30,000. If you want that same engineering software in a developing country like Brazil, you know, they're not poor by any means, but they're very rapidly developing. But if I want to buy that same software in Brazil, I'm going to spend 2 to 3 times as much. Okay? So for example, on the FreeCAD project, we have a lot of global or foreign people, non-US, I should say, people who are doing the development. Why? Because they benefit from it directly. Here they can develop commercial quality software and they don't have to pay for it. And the more popular that software gets, the more people get involved. Okay? And it grows over time. And everybody is then everybody is then contributing to this project, which is continuing to get better. Some open source projects, for example, Blender 3D, which is a 3D modeler, it's a software like Pixar would use to make movies. They use it in Hollywood, and it's actually beating the competition. It's so popular. They implement new features in all of the competition, which costs several $1,000s if you want to buy their versions, have to race to keep up. And it's pretty amazing. So the primary incentive then is really to just do something great. And to be able to free themselves from having to pay money for licenses and be limited by the terms and agreements that are set by a vendor, possibly from a foreign country who doesn't really care about what they're trying to do.
So say that this evolves in the Sauk Valley area, but in different stages, and just for hypothetical reasons, if Sauk Valley Community College is one of the first organizations that gets on board with this open source software, and we take the time to switch all of our Microsoft stuff to open source. If I need to send Lauren a PowerPoint or Kevin at KSP Hospital an Excel spreadsheet in my open source software, will they be able to open it with no problems, or vice versa if they send me something in Microsoft and I open it in open source software? Is there
Compatibility issues
that will happen if everybody's not doing? Is it like an all or nothing for
It's not.
that work together?
That's a good question. And document compatibility has been a difficult issue. And the reason for that is Microsoft Office, technically DocX, XLSX, these formats, they're called OOXML. They are technically an open format as well, okay? But it's Microsoft's open format. It's an ISO standard. But Microsoft went and registered it with the ISO after the Document Foundation registered the ODF with the ISO. Why? Because they saw the ODF as a threat to their software. Because as a vendor, if I can get everybody locked into my data format, then they've got to use my software. So Microsoft registered their own open format. And the reason I say that is because every year that Microsoft has been released, 2007, 2010, 2013, they have had what have been called traditional or transitional OOXML formats. In other words, yes, there's a public specification on how OOXML format data is saved, but in 2007 they had a transitional form. So it was saved kind of like that, but not really. Then again in 2010, then in 2013, and they kept changing the way they saved their own format. So they didn't even abide by their own standard. So this is how a proprietary company creates an open standard and still maintains control over that standard. By changing the way they save documents in each version, they guaranteed that even though if I write, Joel's word processor, right, and it abides by the OOXML standard or specification that they registered with ISO, I still won't be able to read anything Microsoft produces because they keep changing the way they save it in their software. So in that way, they continue to retain control. So that's why it's important to adopt an open standard that is not owned or generated by one specific company. Because in this case of Microsoft, they still have control even though their standard is open. It's getting better. Microsoft is getting better. Microsoft actually saves to ODF very well, and LibreOffice is getting a lot better at reading Microsoft documents. But there are issues, and so you need to kind of do that carefully. You save from a docx to an ODT file, for example, and then you open it up and you take a look and you just make sure everything lines up. The differences are getting to be a lot less severe, and so it's getting much easier to migrate. And there are other open source softwares that read Microsoft formats better than LibreOffice does. So it's kind of a toss-up as to what you get. All the same, it's certainly worth the effort. I think the issues are much less than they used to be. Another thing that you can do in order to avoid that entirely is if the document that you need to send to someone else who runs a different operating system or different word processor, if they only need read-only access to it, you publish it as a PDF. Everybody can read PDF because it's an open standard. So, go ahead.
So looking at the large-scale, long-term implications, and I'll say this, I really like the idea of open source, but if open source wins the day and proprietary software goes away,
Right.
we are in an age where we are transitioning out of manufacturing jobs existing at all.
Mm-hmm.
We are moving into a world where technology development and service are almost the only jobs available for human beings.
Yep.
If we take away proprietary software as an income-generating source, will we be left in a world where only the service industry and the entertainment industry?
That's a big question.
Places where people can be employed. And what will the world look like, or the global unemployment rate look like at that point?
Well, that's a big question. I don't know that open source is really the lens through which you should examine that. But it's a fair question, and actually that probably ties more into the coming of our robot overlords, right? Everybody's worried about AI and robots taking over manufacturing. And what we're seeing is as the technologies change and certain jobs pass away, others start to develop. One of the things that's changing in the way our workforce looks is that the vast majority of new jobs that are added to our economy are contract work. Okay, whether that's good or bad, that's just how it's going. And I can't really say that it's really hard to argue that question on the vantage point of open source versus proprietary. First off, because the open source business model is primarily service oriented. Okay. But a lot of those companies that do service, for example, Red Hat. They make about $2 billion a year providing support for enterprise level Linux to corporations. They also do an awful lot of software development on Linux, and they pass those improvements that they do for corporations upstream to the Linux project, so everybody benefits from it. So a lot of these support corporations are also hiring developers, so there's still that need for technical talent. In addition, the business model for open source is really still kind of undefined. People are trying different things. Thanks for coming. The open source, right now the business model that's most successful is the obvious one, providing support for a project that exists. You know, people are willing to lay out money for support. But people are trying different business models, trying different ideas. There's also open hardware, CPUs, 3D printers, where you can actually download the specifications online and you can make your own if you're somehow capable of doing that. That's getting to be a big thing, and that has a big technical demand for highly skilled labor, not just in the service industry. So, tough question. Any other questions? If not, thank you.